Our next presenter is Thom Achterbosch. He's with the Bargaining and Economic Research at Bargaining University and Research. He's going to speak on healthy diets, reduce land pressure, and this work is done in Nigeria. So, Thom.
Good morning. I've prepared a story for you on work that we are doing in Nigeria. It's funded by the A4NH program, and it's a collaboration with co-authors at my unit. The topic of this paper is healthier diets and reduced land pressure. For us, in the Nigerian A4NH program, we're looking at entry points into the food system for promoting accessible, healthy, and sustainable food solutions. Nigeria is just one of our focus countries, but I think you've been introduced to that program before. And the approach that we take in this paper is to link the macro with the micro, but actually my talk is more on the macro. I think that stands me apart from the rest of the presentations a bit. I would summarize the study by saying that we talk about three major stocks in the food system. One is agricultural technology. A second is land and land surplus, which we can quantify in any unit we want, in square meters or in kilocalories. And then there's diet quality, which we have actually assessed through a diagnostic that uses microdata. And we're trying to mimic if we can close some of the dietary gaps in Nigeria that we observe through macro-level food system changes. And these changes come from the flows that we introduce in this analysis. Now, obviously, there's a lot of income growth and population growth in Nigeria, so what's that doing to the food system? But we also see a huge impact of the international economy on Nigeria. Nigeria itself is a leading economy in West Africa, and it's also a major importer of commodities globally and an exporter then of others. And then we have this flow of land, and land is not a stable stock in Nigeria. It's actually been brought into production very rapidly. There's an unprecedented turnover of savanna land into agricultural land in Nigeria, and there's also a process that has to come to an end. And much of our story is about that process of what happens when the actual land is brought into production, and we expect that to be happening by around 2025. And then our idea or suggestion from this modeling exercise is that we are then up for a hard landing. Now, what would that be? Let's talk a little bit about that in the paper. But also about the opportunities for changing that hard landing into a soft landing scenario, but that in order to get there, we need to make input and land markets work much better, and that has big implications. Okay, so, and I hope you will accept that I'm weaving my methods in with the story, so bear with me, please. This is a Foresight study, and it's very important to be very precise in what Foresight is. So this is an exploration that uses projections. It's not a speculation, it's not a prediction, it's not a forecast. It's a simple what-if scenario that we quantify in a modeling study. This is part of a broader trajectory of scenario development in Nigeria, which actually has as core pillars those yellow steps here marked in yellow, which is interactive work with stakeholders to talk about scenario drivers, to talk about visions, then to have leverage points identified from expert opinion, from microdata, and we challenge that and feed scenario work into that from the models. And then also about solutions and how that works in the political economy in Nigeria in order to get to a better governance of the food system. So we're presenting this as a service to the national and hopefully also state-level policymakers in Nigeria, which then will have to implement a policy. And interestingly, the policies for food security and diets in Nigeria are quite advanced, at least on paper. But the actual implementation of an advanced food systems-oriented policy in practice is very difficult, and we hope to identify some sort of key orientation points for that implementation. So, if we talk about Foresight, it's also good to look backwards, and there have been a lot of changes in Nigeria's food systems which actually point to further future change on infrastructure, on socio-political stability, on land degradation and droughts, and also on cultural change, perhaps. Although that is much less easy to observe in Nigeria, but we see a lot of migration. People are moving around in Nigeria quite a lot, and it's definitely going to have an impact on consumption habits as well. Now, most easily is to look at drivers of economic growth and population change. And if you just look at the numbers here of some scenario projections, then we're up for a major change in Nigeria. And it's actually, in terms of economics, it's one of the most dynamic countries, together with Ethiopia. And also a population growth. We're looking at a country that will, in 2050, be the second or the third population in at least the largest in Africa, and with some of the largest cities in the world. So that's amazing. Another really important driver is the land, and as I said, there has been an unprecedented conversion of savanna land into agricultural land in Nigeria, and some of that has been really well documented with data from the US and very nice visuals, which I could actually have brought, where you see sort of how fast, in just decades, this transition has been, and it's amazing. But it's also coming to an end, and that's our point here, is that there is just, if you look at the numbers, which we have accumulated from 50 by 50 grid cells, then there is just 8 million hectares land left to be brought into production. There are also quite a few reports in Nigeria that state that there is still a 40% land left, but we count only 10% because we actually include the pastures, the land that is being grazed inextensively grazed and used by the nomads and the pastoralists. So this really limits the opportunities for solving your food security issues just by producing more from the land. Now, we bring these drivers into a framework and into a scenario tool where we have GDP growth and where we actually are able to mimic land markets and labor markets that work better than they do today. In economic terms, that means that we're shifting some of the elasticities of transformation and that transform technology into the economy. And we're also able to shift patterns of consumption growth where we moderate the income elasticities of food. And we bring that into a global modeling tool, an advanced tool, which is called Magnet, which is our in-house CGE model, General Computable Equilibrium Model. And so this graph shows you the components of that model, but more importantly, the model actually balances global demand with global supply and trade, including natural resource use, and it gives you indicators on some of the outcomes of the food systems, right? Such as food prices, food security, food accessibility, and inequalities. And in order to understand this tool, what is also important is that it's kind of like a lens at which you look at reality. So I now see that we have you looked around you? Do you know there's a mirror behind you? So if you look into that mirror, if you would just do it, you would look into the mirror and you would basically see each one of us has now an own perspective on this room. Because you're looking in this mirror, right? And the angle at which you look gives you a different point of perspective on the room. Now that's what this model does. Yeah? So our perspectives here are to look at how macronutrients work from field to fork, how climate change and land productivity works. But what we haven't done, for example, is use a biofuel lens or a bioenergy lens or a food waste lens. We haven't done that. So we're still selecting our perspectives here. Thank you for doing that. 1 minute. Terrible. Okay, so let's look at these hard and soft landings. This is the landing. If we use a status quo scenario, then we are in the left-hand side. We're in a land-fixed scenario, and we're seeing land prices boom because there's scarcity of land, and it cascades into consumer prices of 3.8% growth per annum, 3.8%, 4% food inflation on an annual basis. That's terrible. That's dramatic. That's going to give riots and problems and undercuts stability. And then we have a land substitution scenario which actually converts that into a decline of prices. And you can see the hard and soft landing in this slide, and also see that what I don't show you here is actually how the land prices are then providing opportunities for a diversification. So our modeling scenario suggests that once you're able to get more inputs into the agricultural system from high-tech, from more skilled labor, from more inputs, more technology, that you're actually diversifying your economy. And that's actually a new perspective on the debate on whether you need dietary diversity and land, cropping diversity to get dietary diversity. What we see is that economic growth actually points to a diversification in the system if you allow it to happen. And that is the main policy implication that we see in this paper. If you allow the economy, the agricultural economy, to move into the land substitute scenario, which is a major reform in input markets and land markets, and also in labor markets that allows you to reach that scenario, then we are promoting food security and diversity in the diet. Now, with that tool, and this is a bit preliminary, then we're also able to mimic changes in micronutrient availability. And it's also very interesting that that too is affected by which global or which environmental and institutional setting you're at. So if you want to raise a consumer subsidy to improve iron intake, or iron availability at least, in the country, then your costs for subsidizing this is much lower in the land substitute scenario than in the land fixed scenario. We're still working on these numbers and on this analysis, but thought I'd just show you that. So in terms of conclusions, we see that there is a huge opportunity in the Nigerian food system to actually benefit from this economic growth, to let it be a pool for the country, for the country's food system, and that actually agricultural-led development is a major opportunity for Nigeria, but at the same time, it's a huge institutional challenge. Because we see the interactions of labor and land markets, and they currently work in an adverse direction. So the policy recommendations are then to stimulate input intensification, but how to do that, yeah? And be aware that in this international arena, competitiveness is under pressure, and imports through a big harbor city like Lagos is just the easy way out to fill the demand in those cities. And that would be a real waste of the pull factor that is happening with the economic growth there. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.